Good morning. Is this carrying? Good morning, everyone. It's very inspiring for me to look across this vast sea of young and energetic individuals. I'm reminded of something that Mark Twain once said when he quipped that life would be infinitely happier if we were all born at 80 years old and gradually grew to be 18 years old. For those of you who don't know who Mark Twain is, he is America's Mullah Nasreddin. So if you look at the list of founders for iBridge, you'll find that there's a mix of profiles. There are scientists, there are engineers, there are venture capitalists, there are financiers. And all of us have followed a different mental journey to arrive at the same destination, which is that the time has come for an event like iBridge as it relates to Iran. You heard Kamran's mental frame this morning, and I'd like to share with you my own frame about this. And let's see if this is. So I'd like to talk to you about a story regarding two forces. The interaction between these two forces is going to shape the 21st century, and it will determine whether it is an absolute disaster or an absolute triumph. The first of these forces is demography, and it is best described using the concept of a population pyramid. There are many things uncertain about the future. Demography is not one of them. Peter Zeihan, the strategist, perhaps described it best when he said that demography actually leaves very little to interpretation. Once you know birth rates, death rates, then the math of how population dynamics are going to unfold is pretty much determined. It's like the force of gravity. You can't negotiate with gravity, and in the same sense, you can't negotiate with demography. And if you follow the math of demography, you'll find, as we'll discuss, and as Peter Zeihan and others have pointed out, that the next decade or so suggests that we're moving into a very difficult period in terms of availability of capital and the cost of capital. So when you see that, then you look for a compensating force. And the natural compensating force that one looks for is technology. Now, technology is known to be a disruptive force for centuries. But what is perhaps more disturbing recently is that a number of serious thinkers, including economists like Gordon Moore or Tyler Cowen, as well as Silicon Valley venture capitalists like Peter Thiel, have developed a point of view and a thesis that, in fact, the pace of technological innovation is slowing down and possibly plateauing. This is a very worrisome trend if it is true. And so the balance between those two forces are really what's going to determine our century. Let's start with understanding the problems associated with demography. So the ability of an economy to grow depends on the relative distribution of workers who consume and workers who save and generate capital. That's best described using a population pyramid. So if you plot the population of a country in age groups, you get a shape that looks like a pyramid. And the reason it does that is mortality eats away at each successive layer of the age group, resulting in that particular shape. Now, from the point of view of economic capital, this pyramid is naturally divided into four groups. The lowest age group are children. So children obviously don't work. They need to eat. They need a lot of clothes as they grow through different stages. They need shelter, and they need an education. So while they're very cute, at least some of them, from a point of view of capital, they're very expensive and a drain on the capital of their working parents. The next group, basically from around 20 until the mid-40s, is a group of young workers. This group are massive consumers, and they're critical to the ability of an economy to grow because they're the group that, more than any other group, generates demand. This group has children, they're getting a first home, they're buying cars, and so they're major consumers. The problem is that since they're junior participants in the workforce, their earnings capacity is not anywhere near their need to consume. And so they're both massive borrowers and massive consumers. Between the ages of early 40s and mid-60s, the hard lifting is basically in the past. The children are leaving home, the mortgage has been paid for, the loans have been paid for, and so you reach a point where this age group is at the peak of their earnings capacity and at the bottom of their borrowing needs. And so this group is as capital rich as the segment before that was capital poor. From the point of view of the economy, this is the critical sector because since they still have significant earnings generation capacity, they are willing to take risk with their investments. And so they're willing to invest their capital in generating a growing economy, such as startups, operating businesses, and the like. But by the time this age group gets above their mid-60s range, then the earnings generation capacity stops. You get into the retirement age. This group is very risk-averse from the point of view of capital, and so they invest their money in government bonds and CDs. And therefore, they're a drain on the economic system because they're drawing down on the capital base. It turns out that you can say a lot about an economy by looking at the interaction of these four segments. So as an example, let's look at Iran's current population pyramid. So if you first look at this population pyramid, it looks less like a pyramid than it does like a spaceship. It actually, in the midsection, is quite bloated. There's a lot of young workers in this population pyramid. And basically what that means is that the capital needs of the young workers and the children are much larger than the ability of the mature workers to provide them with capital. The country is not able to domestically generate the amount of capital that it needs to grow. And that has two implications. The first implication is that either the government will have to expend its resources to subsidize this segment that has a need for capital, or it needs to figure out a way to attract foreign capital to make up for the shortage of domestic capital, or both. Now, if in addition there are artificial barriers to the international flow of capital, like trade sanctions or financial sanctions, imbalances develop in the economy, and the cost of capital basically goes up significantly, and business formation gets damaged. And so this problem needs to be solved. Now, you may look at this, and in case you think that Iran is unique in terms of having this kind of a spaceship distribution, there's another country that had this exact same distribution 25 years ago. And that country was the United States. So in around 1990, the baby boomer generation basically resulted in a bulging of the youth sector for the United States, and it also had a spaceship-like economy. And you would think that with this kind of a structure, there would be significant pressures in terms of cost of credit. In fact, exactly the opposite happened. How did that happen? Well, three things happened. First of all, the Cold War ended. Right around 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed, and as a result of that, the government shifted significant resources that had been allocated to military spending to more productive uses in the economy. The second thing that happened was that Europe around the same time began to get rid of many of its fragmented currencies and go towards a unified currency. That process created a lot of uncertainty in markets, and so money started to look for safer havens than the European currencies, and therefore there was a big movement of capital towards dollar-denominated assets. Those two things by themselves would have been good, but then a third thing that happened. And that third thing was the first internet boom, which was the big productivity wave that happened in the United States in Silicon Valley and resulted in a tsunami of capital from around the world to go into Silicon Valley and lift up the economy. And so over the course of the next 15 years, when the US population pyramid was at substantial risk, these three things resulted in gigantic value creation. Now, what happens then is that the baby boomers that were the source of the problem in the preceding decade have now moved to the segment where they're mature workers and they're significant capital generators. And so what that did was to transform a spaceship population pyramid to a rocket ship population pyramid. Gigantic amount of capital was thrown off by the baby boomers. So much so, in fact, that the generation that followed it, the so-called Generation X, is actually smaller in terms of its contribution than the baby boomers. And so they couldn't even absorb all that capital. So what happened? The cost of capital plummeted in the United States, creating a huge credit boom. And even that wasn't enough to absorb all of the excess capital that was generated. And so that capital started to look internationally in search of investment opportunities, and that resulted in the big wave in the emerging markets where that capital started to go and lift all boats that existed there. Now that's all well and good, but if you now project to 2025, 10 years from now, the problem is that that effective baby boomer generation moves into retirement age. And now that rocket ship population pyramid looks like a sumo wrestler. It's big, it's gigantic, it can't move very fast. And if you factor in, this is, by the way, not unique to the United States, it's happening all over Europe, it's happening in Japan. So essentially across the entire advanced economies, you've got this population that had been generating enormous capital that is now moving into retirement age, and they will have massive healthcare costs that are going to absorb a significant perception of the resources of the economy. So what is going to happen, all things equal, is that the cost of credit is going to balloon over the next 10 years, and we will expect to see that investment capital from around the world is going to be pushed back, brought back, and this is going to cause a significant pressure in the emerging markets where there was a rising tide lifting all boats, and suddenly every country has to compete on its own merits. So if you stick with that picture, it's a very worrisome picture. And if the pessimists are right, that the rate of technological innovation is slowing down, then we have a very serious problem on our hands. We have a real dilemma. And the question is that an accurate foundation in terms of looking to the future? And the answer that I would propose is that it is actually an incorrect way to looking at the future. So to understand that point, the fact that technology has been disruptive is well known. What is far less known is that the pace of technological innovation is actually going to take off on a scale that has never before been experienced in human history. Excuse me. And to understand why that's the case, it's important to understand that human intuition is biologically linked to a linear scale of growth. So if I take 10 paces across this stage, by the time I get to the other side, I will be at position 10. But if I take 10 paces on an exponential scale, then in the 10th step, I will be at a position 1024. Those are vastly different paces of adjustment. Now, it turns out that this phenomenon that is not actually well understood because it's not part of human experience was actually understood by a poet about 1,000 years ago. That poet's name was Ferdowsi. If you look at the Shahnameh, there's a story there about the Persian king who was introduced to the game of chess. And he was so enamored with this game that he told the inventor to name his reward. And asked him how many sacks of gold did he want. And the inventor, being savvy, said, I really don't need sacks of gold. I'd like to get my reward in the form of grains of rice. And the way I'd like to receive that reward is I'd like to have one grain placed on the first square and then have that grain doubled on each subsequent square. So the king, thinking that the inventor was a simpleton, laughed at him and asked his vizier to go and get his reward. So the vizier went to the treasury and came back and sheepishly whispered in the king's ear, there's no way that we can satisfy the ask. And you can see why that's the case. Here we go. So you start off with the first grain. In the second square, you'll have 2. In the third square, you'd have 4. And so far, things look fairly linear. The problem is that by the time you get to the end of the first half of the chessboard, you've got 2 billion grains. And roughly, that's about 50 metric tons. If you assume that a grain of rice is about 25 milligrams, you're getting to 50 metric tons. Now, if you thought that was a lot, wait until you get to the end of the chessboard. So by the 64th square, you've got 2 times 10 to the 19 grains, which is roughly 500 billion metric tons of rice. And if you want to get a sense of what that is, that's about 1,000 times more than the entire grain production on the planet in the last year. So this exponential phenomenon is actually quite remarkable. And Ray Kurzweil, who Kamran also mentioned, has actually thought about this quite hard and is fond of noting that since the programmable computer was invented in World War II, we've gone through 32 doublings in terms of computational power. And so essentially, we're at the point where we're at the halfway point on a chessboard, and now we're entering into the second half of this chessboard. So the question is, what kind of exponential growth can we expect to see? And the answer is that, let's just look at for the first 15 years, between now and 2030, what can we expect? Because that's the horizon that we have greatest visibility on. And the 3 areas where we're likely to see the greatest change are computers, biotech, and nanotech. So let's look at some of these. You've all seen Google Glass. It's kind of a geeky kind of thing. Well, by 2030, we'd be able to download every piece of information on Earth onto our contact lenses. We'll be able to see every movie. We'll be able to read every book. We'll be able to see every piece of news. Halfway around the world, we'll be able to see what our children are doing on the other side. Halfway around the world, we'll be able to see what factories are happening at the other side of the globe. And you can imagine what kind of a transformation in terms of productivity that would be. By 2030, driverless cars will not be the exception, they will be the norm. The shape of transportation, of moving people around, is going to dramatically change. Traffic jams will be a thing of the past as cars communicate with each other, replacing human drivers. And you can imagine the level of productivity that is likely to be achieved with people sitting in the car as they're transported around. By 2030, we're going to have quantum computing. Today's computers are based on bits that are either 0 or 1. When you get to an atomic scale, a quantum bit or a qubit can simultaneously have the state of 0 or 1, which means that rather than computational power increasing linearly, computational power will be increasing exponentially. There's actually today a company in Canada called D-Wave that claims to have built the first quantum computer. The US Defense Establishment and Google are actually experimenting with this computer. By 2030, we're going to have flexible electronic displays, so-called organic light-emitting diodes. So in your pocket, rather than carrying this hard-form cell phone or smartphone, we're going to have flexible pieces of electronic instrumentation that fold in our pocket, and when we take them up, we can scroll them as large as we want. That is going to dramatically change how products are going to look in the future. Imagine walls in your home no longer will have wallpaper on them, but they'll have electronic displays. And what kind of a difference in terms of communication that's going to make looking out. Virtual reality will result in the ability to walk on the moon, to explore the surface of Mars, to visit any museum on Earth. In fact, the concept of a museum will likely become obsolete when one has the ability and the quality of resolution that virtual reality will bring. The phenomenon that has powered the growth in computational power is called Moore's Law, which roughly translates into a doubling of computational power every 2 years. The problem is that by 2020, Moore's Law is going to come to an end. And the reason it's going to come to an end is that the way that one is able to get smaller and smaller transistors is by shining ultraviolet light and etch on silicon wafers tiny transistor patterns. By the wavelength of ultraviolet light is about 30 nanometers. So by the time you get to around 30 nanometers, quantum effects are going to kick in, and electrons are going to work their way through the transition layer, and they're going to, essentially, you're not going to be able to build any more transistors smaller than that scale on a silicon chip. We'll have to go to new materials, and there's a couple of different candidates for them. One is called a carbon nanotube, and it's about an atom in width. So that's an electron scanning microscope image of a carbon nanotube, which looks like a Persian carpet. It's actually not. Each of those strands are about 1 nanometer thick, and a nanometer is about 1/10,000 the width of a human hair. By 2030, we will have significant change in terms of medicine. We will have computers that will be able to ingest all the medical knowledge that exists in the world into their artificial intelligence forms. And rather than going to a doctor and you saying, well, I have these symptoms, tell me what it is, and the doctor, based on his or her experience, can tell you, well, you have this or you have that, you will have computers that have the knowledge of all the doctors in the world built into them that will give you probabilistically what is likely to be the cause of your symptoms. So essentially, the role that doctors play today are going to be fundamentally transformed. I actually have more time, give it more time to the other guys, so I'm going to take this too. By 2030, we'll be able to engineer new human tissue. We'll be able to engineer ears, noses, lips, blood vessels, hearts, pancreases, and so forth. The way you do that is you basically take a mold that is in the shape of a biodegradable substance like polyglycolic acid, and you put human cells into it. You grow those human cells. They grow into the shape of the individual pieces, and you can see already experiments that have generated that. So this is going to transform engineering of human beings. Stem cell technology by 2030 Stem cells are the roots of all cells. That's how all cells grow. And by understanding stem cells, we'll get to the root of many different types of diseases, whether it's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or genetic bone disease. These things will one by one get tackled. Gene therapy is the science of understanding human genetic defects, be that at the individual level or even more profoundly, when you go into the individual sex cell, you can change the dynamics of the genetic defects so that all future generations coming from that individual do not have the same problem. Nanoparticles are basically smart bombs that go after cancer cells. What is the beauty of nanoparticles is that they are larger than healthy cells, but cancer cells are riddled with pores, and so these nanoparticles can inject themselves into the cancerous cell and inject their medicine into it. And that's going to revolutionize the problem of aging and cancer. So that's in the next 15 years. Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, once said that for sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what will happen to the middle of the century? Stem cell technology will have conquered aging. People will live to be 150 or 200 years old. We will forget about these two-dimensional TVs. We'll have holographic visualizations for entertainment. We will have so-called claytronic atoms, or CADAMs, that are able to shapeshift, and so entire furniture at the press of a button can dramatically change to a different form. And the way we will get our energy is by recreating the sun on Earth. Except that in the case of sun, you have gravitational energy that keeps those thermonuclear interactions in place. We're going to use magnetic fields to keep them in place. This actually was part of my PhD dissertation at Princeton 30 years ago. By the end of the century, the separation between man and machine will gradually come to an end. We will have computers that will be recreating themselves as opposed to having man create computers with increasing powers of intelligence. Whether it's vision or sight or intelligence, will be enhanced by technology. Rather than the electrochemical signals between neurons, which travel at the speed of 100 meters per second, people will be able to think at the speed of light, which is 300 million meters per second. So a 3 million increase in terms of thinking speeds. This is what Ray Kurzweil calls a runaway singularity. And in some sense, this is the epitome of the development of science. So I think you get the major picture. The picture is that the exponential pace of technology is actually going to more than overcome the challenge associated with an aging population. What are the morals of this story for Iran? 3 things, I would say. The first is, if you remember the population pyramid of Iran, Iran is not able to domestically generate sufficient capital to meet the investment needs of its population. It will need to figure out a way to have foreign capital come into the country to build up the economy. Iran will be competing with 100 other countries who are going to be doing exactly the same thing. And a former chairman of mine at my former bank, Walter Wriston, once said that capital goes where it's welcome and stays where it's well treated. Second, don't drive into the future while looking into the rearview mirror. What I mean by that is that it is a mistake to build an economy for the future based on what's worked in the past. What's worked in the past is based on labor arbitrage. That has come to an end. The chances that Iran will be able to compete with the East Asian economies at this point on the basis of cost is very low. And by the way, digital manufacturing is likely to eliminate the need for geographic supply chain separation altogether. And lastly, The Silicon Valley technologist Mark Andreessen is fond of saying that in the 21st century, there'll be two types of people. There'll be people who tell computers what to do and people who get orders from computers. If that is true, then you want to build a population that is of the first variety, not of the second variety. That means building a tech-savvy population that is scientifically literate, and even that is not enough. You need to build a population that is not only tech-savvy, but understands entrepreneurialism. And that brings us full circle back to the question that I posed initially. The need for iBridge is that we need to train an entire generation of talented Iranians, not only to be technologically literate, but to be entrepreneurial and to build an innovation-based economy. Thank you for your time.